Thanks everyone for attending tonight and hearing David speak about this book that he's edited. I first met David at the grand opening of the Ottawa Cafe Centre. Jim and I drove down for the opening, and then we drove home again, and it was a long trip. So it was great to see David again and make the trip down here, because I know how long it is to get here. So he's not driving home tonight, hopefully. So yeah, here to share his book and the story along with it, and I believe he has got a phone in to talk about the book as well. And Christine, are you still going to read a passage from it? Great. So thanks everyone for attending. Thank you, David.
Thank you for coming out. So this is a book of stories, and some of you have it in your hand. And so I thought it would be appropriate to tell a little bit of my story. Thank you for doing that. I got involved in gender issues in an interesting way. A lot of guys come into this because their lives are affected negatively by something that happens to them, but it wasn't like that for me. I got intrigued by what was going on in the world. And it happened like this. My wife, in my first marriage, we had a dog, but no children. And my wife told me one day she was taking the dog to the vet. And then she called me up and said, "I've left you." I guess she wanted the dog. But anyway, I said, "Why did you do it that way? Why didn't you talk to me? I thought that you would, I didn't even know you were thinking about leaving." And she said, "Well, I was afraid you'd be violent." And I was like, seriously? I haven't been violent in my adult life. And so, anyway, I talked to her, and she was like, this is how men are. And so I took a look around, and I saw that the story in the culture was a story about male power and female victimhood. And I thought, this is strange. This is a puzzle. And I got interested. I got interested in how come a story that was very one-sided was yet perpetuating itself, was surviving for years, and seemed to be unchallenged. So I found that I was very interested to engage with that public story. And the first way that I engaged was with a magazine. This is going back a little ways now. This was Canada's magazine of gender equality. I was the editor and the publisher for something over 10 years. That's why I'm wearing this T-shirt. And it was men's stories, essentially, about what their lives were like. And I saw it as an answer to the culture being full of women's stories. But it seems like men's stories are not quite as interesting as women's. And so I lost a lot of money doing this for 10 years. And I eventually had to stop. So I spent a few more years thinking about this problem, this story in the culture. And my interest is to understand it from a psychological point of view. I want to know if something is, if something is a story and we're not able to penetrate it, we're not able to challenge it seriously, then the answer must be psychology. It's got to be something in the unconscious. And so I spent years thinking about that and studying. And I eventually wrote a book about what I thought was really going on. And it was about the nature of women's power. And this was my first book, The Hand That Rocks the World. It's the title comes from a poem, which was about 150 years ago, which starts by saying, "The hand that rocks the cradle rules the world." So I shortened it to "The Hand That Rocks the World." So it's about women's power. So the answer in terms of how to understand what's been going on in the world around gender lies in the power that women have that is hard to name and hard to identify, because women don't experience it as power while they exert it. I'll give you a story to illustrate how that is. So I was at a workshop once, and a woman in the workshop at one point, she came to me in a break and said, can you explain something to me? I was challenged about this particular thing, and some other guy who said something that seemed much more scary to me wasn't challenged. So anyway, I was working, this was when I was working out what was going on. And I explained to her that men are afraid of shaming from women. This was the thing I was getting, that for men, honor is a really important factor. Death before dishonor is a male cry. And women have the keys to men's honor. And I suggested that what she had done was interpreted as shaming, and that was why she was challenged. And that this is as big a deal, I thought, for men. Shaming is as big a deal as violence is for women. And that therefore in any workshop we need 2 rules. No violence, and that's essentially because that's women's big fear, and no shaming, because that's men's big fear. Anyway, here's what happened next. We parted on good terms. She thanked me for my explanation. I thought we had a real good conversation. But then in the next session of the group, she said, I have to leave. I can't stay here. I asked a man for some help, and he abused me. And I feel terrible. I have to leave. And the whole group abandoned its workshop agenda for the next hour and a half and tried to persuade this woman to stay. Her story about what happened was never investigated. It was taken at face value. And she was reassured and comforted and pleaded with to stay. And after an hour and a half, she agreed that she would stay. And at that point, I said to the group, look at what happened here. This woman was able to take over the group agenda. That's a hugely powerful thing to do. And yet, she didn't feel powerful while she was doing it. She felt abused. She felt very powerless. So that was the key. That was the final thing. That night, I had an insight, and I crafted a model that I've got in my book here of the power balance between men and women. But that was the final piece of the puzzle for me, the nature of female power in society that is not experienced as powerful by women. So that's been my journey, is to try to understand. And I feel like with that book, I came to the place where, okay, I know what's going on now. So now the question is, what do you do about it? How do you work with this? That's my challenge now. That's what I'm trying to do now. I'm trying to find a way to work with it. And so this book that is being launched here tonight, Daughters of Feminism, is a book of women's voices. And I chose women's voices because women carry more credibility when it comes to speaking about gender than men do, by several times. You might have noticed about 3 years ago there was a monk debate. Monk debates are a big deal here in Canada. They're very large debates. Anyway, the topic of this one was, are men obsolete? Are men obsolete? What a question. Here's what's interesting. To debate the question, we had 2 women arguing that men were obsolete and 2 women arguing that they weren't. So the question of whether men are obsolete can be debated entirely without men having anything to say about it. This is the nature of the gender dialogue that we are having in our current culture. So women's voices are privileged, are powerful, are seen as credible, and men's not so much. So, okay, I need to live with that. So this is a book of women's voices. And it's a book also that tries to present the gender story in a way that I think it should be presented. So let me give you a little context for that. In the 60s, we had two kinds of gender politics going on. We had, if we look at the racial side of it, okay, we had Martin Luther King. And he was speaking about collaboration between blacks and whites. And he had a vision of gender equality, what it would look like, what he was trying to go towards. And it was positive, and it was inspirational. And he was inviting people in. If you've never seen his I Have a Dream speech, it's magnificent, right? It brings me to tears every time I watch it. That's, I think, what identity politics should look like. It should be invitational, it should be inspirational, it should involve everybody. And anyway, as we know, just about exactly 50 years ago, he was assassinated. And at the same time that was going on was another kind of identity politics, which on the racial side was Black Panthers and Malcolm X and that kind of thing. And that was finger-pointing, it was accusatory, it was grievance-based, it was morally superior. It was, in my opinion, very unhealthy. And after Martin Luther King was assassinated, it seemed that that was the politics of identity that became cemented into our culture. And we've had 50 years of grievance politics, 50 years of finger-pointing, of accusation, principally of everybody's universal scapegoat, straight white men. So, okay. So I want to go back to what Martin Luther King originated. I think that what we need is a politics of gender, since that's my particular interest, that is invitational, that is inspirational, that is not morally superior, that is not grievance-based, that is not accusatory. So that's what I've tried to present here. So these are stories of women about how they came to gender balance, how they came to appreciate the legitimacy of men's issues as well as the legitimacy of women's issues. And my hope is that this can begin to be an antidote for what we're seeing in society, which I think is so very damaging, and I don't believe is leading us to a place where we're going to have gender peace or gender equality. The very foundation of the identity politics that we've had for the last 50 years is inequality, because it's built on moral superiority. Victims are morally superior to perpetrators. And as long as you're talking about victims and perpetrators, you're talking about moral inequality, and you're talking about institutionalizing that inequality. So I don't think that takes us any place we want to go. So this is my personal attempt to do something that I think is healthier and more visionary, more collaborative. So I invited a number of women. Some of them are quite prominent in the movement. Some of them are not as well known. A couple of them are just my personal friends. One of them is my dental hygienist, who I talk with about these things like I talk with everybody, and who became interested because of that. And there are two here tonight who can talk with us, read a little bit of their chapters. And the first will be Christine.
Hi, I'm going to read a little insert of my contribution to the Daughters of Feminism. And I'll begin here. In the early 90s, I met a handsome, muscular gentleman driving a city bus. We dated, and I eventually moved in with him and his 3 sons. In this relationship, I discovered the advance in women's legal rights. Women and mothers' rights were being polarized, and the power had shifted from men to women. the opposite of what I experienced as a child in the 60s, 70s. I had always felt the sting of being female, but I now observed firsthand the sting of being a father in the 90s. The ex-wife abandoned the family. She went out one night with the family car and never returned. She didn't want any part of motherhood or her husband. Without his knowledge, she had for months stopped paying household bills and pocketed the money. Also, she had an accumulation of unpaid parking tickets. The police arrived at the house and arrested him for outstanding parking fees. Hauled off to the police station, he had to pay the fees immediately or face incarceration. She had set out to cripple her ex-husband, but took from her sons. She avoided paying child support. She's a deadbeat mom who abandoned her children for over a year. Yet she had more legal rights in the eyes of the courts than the father who had custody and was the sole provider. After I moved in, the ex-wife did even more damning things. She didn't want to be with her ex-husband, but didn't want anyone else to be with him either. It broke my heart when the boys came home and would share that their mother had dumped them at a relative's place. She had no interest in quality time with them. She would buy toys and leave them to entertain themselves. Often they returned home starving. I will never forget when the youngest, 4 years old, fell to his knees and licked from the floor the blob of dressing I accidentally dropped while preparing a snack. I should have walked away from the craziness of the ex-wife. I stayed to advocate for the boys and the father. I witnessed firsthand the father being shamed and humiliated by the police, who joked amongst themselves about a strapping, muscular man being physically assaulted by a woman. If the allegations had come from her, the outcome would have been different. If the father should withhold visitation, the police would be at the door in an instant, and he would be incarcerated. Yet if she was late or didn't return the boys, no action was taken. The police would tell him to be patient. When he would pick up or drop off the boys at her place, she would frequently falsely accuse him of various things. She was manipulating her rights as a mother, and the father, with primary custody, was overlooked. Things have changed from when I was young. Countless times the mother never showed up to pick up the boys or would randomly drop them off without notice. After seeing so much of her manipulation and spitefulness, I volunteered to be the father's witness while he remained in the car to protect him from the false allegations. I walked up the stairs to the front door of her townhouse. She held the door open and the boys filed out. Just as the last boy was down the steps, she hurled insults at me and pushed me down the stairs. I could have seriously been injured, but I managed to regain my balance without falling. Arriving home with the boys, I began preparing dinner. There was a knock at the door. A police officer was asking for me. To my confusion, I was being arrested for assaulting the mother. No, it was the other way around, I said. She assaulted me. I never laid a hand on her. She pushed me down the stairs. I was adamant. Rather than cuffing me, and immediately he agreed to take my statement. The boys were playing. They could not hear us. I explained that I was being falsely accused of something that she did. And if he didn't believe me, then he should interview the boys. Do it outdoors. No eye contact. No possible intimidation on my part. They know the truth, I pleaded. The officer completed his interview with the boys. He had me sign a statement in which I agreed to turn myself in at the police station the next day to be processed and fingerprinted. Even though the boys corroborated my statement, the officer said he believed me. Charges were laid since the mother called first. I expected that if I had been a man, I would have been arrested immediately and hauled off to the police station. In the end, I, an innocent victim of malicious intent, was falsely charged for assault, processed, and fingerprinted. I faced a judge without a lawyer. The judge reprimanded me and told me not to return to court without a lawyer. Facing criminal charges and possible jail, I paid $3,000 for a lawyer. Charges were eventually dropped. The ex-wife never once showed up for court, even to testify. She was never addressed or punished for wasting the police or the court's time. So that's my contribution.
I was just mentioning that as I was reading through the entire book after it was published, I started to read the other stories and feel maybe a little bit self-conscious about how long my story was. But I tried to imagine taking some of that out, and I couldn't. Every part of my journey feels so important to me. Each of the individual experiences that I've had on their own could have been easily ignored or brushed off or explained away somehow, and for so long, that's exactly what I did with many of them. But it's really the accumulation of all of them that's led me to this place of empathy for men. And like I said, I can't see having left any of them out. There's actually many more that keep popping into my memory since writing for the book, and especially since reading the other stories too. So this one part of my story in particular that I'll read for you now was one of the experiences I had that really forced me to sit up and take notice of how we treat and view men in our society. So I'm going to read to you about the experience I had working in an erotic massage parlor. Just let me know if this is okay, if you can hear me. Was that good so far?
Everybody is nodding.
Okay, excellent. So I'll begin reading. I was looking for ways to make extra money under the table, and I wondered if my body could have the sexual value that it did before, the power to be desired and to arouse a man enough for him to pay his hard-earned money for it. I was nervous. I felt fraudulent in offering my body this way, knowing what a body could look like, what mine had looked like once, and what mine looked like now. But when I went for my interview, it wasn't a concern. There were women with all kinds of bodies there, and they were all making money. When I started working, I was shocked at how easy it was. Erotic massage is basically a regular relaxation massage with what we call a manual release at the end. Clients pay a door fee to the spa and a predetermined tip to the massage attendant. Extra services can be negotiated, like how much clothing the attendant removes, just her top, lingerie, or she's fully nude. There's body slides, some limited touching like breasts, buttocks, legs, face, but there's never supposed to be any kissing, oral sex, or intercourse. Some girls do offer those services illegally, but they belong in escorting. I was explicit with my clients that I didn't offer what we called full service, and I never did any of that. I always had the sweetest clients. They were all really nice and usually slightly, if not totally, embarrassed about wanting to pay for pleasure. They all let me lead the sessions. I usually had to guide them through which extras I would allow. Otherwise, they would almost never ask. And if they did, they were very apologetic about it. I'm sorry if this is out of line, and please feel free to say no, but your breasts are just so beautiful, and I would really love to touch them. Many of them closed their eyes or tried not to look at me, despite explicitly paying for me to be naked so they could. I often had to take their hands and place them on me to let them know it was okay. Many of them trembled. This was a whole new level of sexual power that blew my mind. They were paying to be there, paying for me to touch them and give them a pleasurable experience, yet none of them felt entitled to my body. I can think of one exception, but even he asked first, and we decided together that he'd be happier with a different attendant. And I know I'm just one girl, and this isn't necessarily a representation of the sex industry as a whole, but I didn't see the sex-obsessed, perverted, abusive, and predatory men I expected to see based on the mainstream narrative. I saw lonely, sincere, desperate men. They often explained apologetically how they were happily married and loved their wives, but that sex and physical intimacy was just no longer a part of their relationship. They didn't want to leave their wives, but they had needs too. I hated seeing how ashamed they were of those needs. Women's sexuality is so celebrated. Why is men's sexuality so shameful? Many of them had a new baby at home, and their wives were simply exhausted. I remember being that woman myself. I told them about my similar experience as a mother, and I empathized with where they were at as a couple. I was always a little more lenient with my boundaries with those men. Perhaps I was trying to make up for what I hadn't been able to offer Roger. That was one common group of clients. The other kind of clients I had were single men who were not attractive by conventional standards. They were typically overweight, older, had acne, psoriasis, they were socially awkward or very shy, or had something else that made them less likely to find a long-term partner. While I did massage those clients, most of them just returned to talk or cuddle. They wanted my attention, and it didn't matter if it was sexual. One man listen to music for an hour. Another would bring McDonald's, and we would just sit and talk. He said he just wanted to make me laugh. I had many requests to go on dates and to hang out, so I started offering that as a service too. The tip was still paid to me for my time, but instead of paying a door fee, they paid for the dinner. This is when I noticed that I had more than just sexual power. I had a kind of moral power as well. These men wanted my approval and validation. They were so comforted by the fact that I was acknowledging them as human beings. They often commented on how much they appreciated that I looked them in the eye when they were speaking and how rare that was. I felt extremely valuable as a woman, and I started asking myself, when did we stop seeing men as people? When did we stop caring about them? I thought of feminism again in that famous tagline, feminism is about equality. No, it isn't. None of my feminist friends were thinking about men this way. I never read feminist articles that talked about men the way I was seeing them. The men I was meeting weren't hateful misogynists. They worshipped women, and I felt like I had superpowers.
So this is a contribution by a woman in Vancouver called Catherine Hogan. I was sitting on the train for the first time since my car accident. When the dangerous guy boarded, my reaction was automatic. Surprise, surprise. A man stinking of drink and leering at women, objectifying us and harassing us with his male gaze. It was something I'd thought many times in the past. Before being brain injured, when I was still the brash, masculine, painfully independent young woman I had learned I must be. But in the months since being injured, much had changed. I was seeing the world in a new way, as if for the first time. That day on the train, I saw something I had never seen before, and it changed my life. The dangerous guy, belligerent and imposing, muttering slurred insults and sexual invitations, was all I had seen before. This time, though, my ideas about men were less rigid. I was learning that the gender story I'd been taught wasn't true. It isn't a horror story after all. That day on the train, instead of seeing only the bad guy, I was open to seeing a different kind of man. For the first time, I saw the other man on the train. I watched, my heart thumping with pride and sorrow, as the other men all made silent eye contact with each other and exchanged subtle gestures, communicating with strangers they'd never met before, coordinating together. I watched as each man carefully adjusted his posture or position, moving around the train, sitting in an empty seat, or standing in the aisle. I watched as each man physically put his body between the dangerous guy and every woman on the train. They literally put their bodies between us and him so that, if needed, they could protect us. The truth I realized that day is that 99.9% of men are like that. I, like so many other women, especially those who've learned the horror story of men and gender told by feminism, had focused only on the 0.1% that are dangerous and had believed that they represent all men, dismissing male heroism where I saw it, if I allowed myself to see it at all. I was wrong. I was so wrong. The reality is that the vast majority of men are just like those I saw on the train that day. Why didn't I see them before? Simple. I wasn't looking. So, that's Daughters of Feminism. I'd be pleased, and I think Gemma is still on the line here, and Christine is here. We'd be happy to answer any questions that you have.
So you don't have one story from men in the book?
No, I have an introduction that I wrote. That's the only writing by a man.
Do you refer them back to your previous book?
I refer to my previous book in my author bio at the end.
it seems to me it's the only group that's not allowed to speak up for themselves are straight white men. And I refuse to use the term cis, straight biologically male men. Because you don't see the language. Because when you see the language, you've already seen the war. In my opinion. And that's as a butch dyke. So, you know, I used to get all the lesbians used to come to my practice. And now they boycott my practice because I'm a conservative and I take up for them. And you know what? Don't give a fuck. Still going to do it.
Well, from a man, thank you for that.
You're welcome. And it's because I realize the power I have out of their bullshit intersectionality. If I go through all their intersections, I'm the top. I'm the only one that should be allowed to speak. Masculine, identified, dyke, immigrant, handicapped, mama's a Cherokee. All right, I got all the intersections. Let's
Yeah.
stop. Right? You need to shut up and listen to me. My daughter's half black. Let's talk. Right? They don't want to do that.
No.
But if you say we shouldn't let natives talk on native issues, everybody loses their damn minds. But we can't let straight white men talk on those issues? I don't think so. Not happening. That's my contribution. But I view the world through masculine psychology. Like, I think the way a straight man thinks. So I see that. I see the shaming. I see the hurt. I see the honor and the provide, protect, being denigrated. Right? I see all of that. Like, you know, like they say, everybody wants to be a lion until it's time to go out and do some lion shit, and then everybody gets scared of blood and guts. So that does put me in a very privileged position because I can see it, and I also have the privilege of being female, so people can't shut me down.
You should know that this book is one of a pair. It has a sister book, and the book is called Sons of Feminism, and it's stories of men. And it's stories. It's by a friend of mine, the editor, Janice Fiamengo.
Yes, I watched her.
Right. And so it's stories of men about what it's like to grow up in a feminist culture.